Well, look, in fairness to all the countries we've talked to about being and having a presence on the ground, I think they want to know specifically, what the mandate, what the specific mandate it was, the funding mechanism looks like. So we're very grateful to Pakistan for their offer to be a part of it, or at least their offer to consider being a part of it. I think we owe them a few more answers before we can ask anybody to firmly commit. But I feel very confident that we have a number of nation states acceptable to all sides in this who are willing to step forward and be a part of that stabilization force. And certainly, Pakistan is key if they agree to do so. But I think we owe them a few more answers before we get there. We're trying to make a lot of progress here with I think the next step here is announcing the Board of Peace, announcing the Palestinian Technocratic Group that will help provide daily governance. And then once that's in place, I think that will allow us to firm up the stabilization force, including how it's going to be paid for, what the rules of engagement are.
Did you just hear that? Did you hear what you just heard in that clip? Because I need you to understand what we're witnessing here in real time is the brazen architecture of 21st century imperialism being constructed with bureaucratic language and technocratic flourishes, as if the entire grotesque machinery of neocolonial domination could be sanitized by talking about funding mechanisms and rules of engagement and mandate specifics, while what's actually happening is the United States government openly shopping for foreign militaries willing to police Palestinians on behalf of American strategic interests in the Middle East. And I want you to really sit with the obscenity of what's being described here, because U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio just confirmed that Pakistan has offered to send troops for the proposed international stabilization force in Gaza, and he's talking about this like it's some kind of generous humanitarian gesture, when what we're actually watching is the commodification of state violence, where Pakistan's powerful military dictatorship gets to curry favor with Trump, while Muslim-majority troops get deployed to do the dirty work of occupation that Israel and America need done, but can't politically afford to do themselves. And you're going to hear a lot of sanitized language about peacekeeping and stabilization, but let me be absolutely clear about what stabilization means in this context, because stabilization is imperial code for pacification, and when Rubio says we owe them a few more answers before we can ask anybody to firmly commit, what he means is, we need to work out the precise terms under which foreign soldiers will enforce American-designed political arrangements on a traumatized population that has endured genocide. Now here's where this gets even more insidious, and I need you to pay attention because U.S. Central Command hosted a conference in Doha on December 16 to discuss the deployment of an international stabilization force to Gaza, and the United States has delivered formal requests to over 70 nations to volunteer troops and supplies for deployment, yet none have committed soldiers as of yet. And do you understand what that means? That means literally this week, just days ago, the American military-industrial complex gathered dozens of countries in Qatar to essentially hold auditions for who gets to be the face of foreign military control in Gaza, and the reason nobody's committing, because every single government understands the political toxicity of what's being asked of them, which is to provide the boots on the ground for what a State Department document describes as supporting the demilitarization of Gaza, dismantling terrorist infrastructure, and decommissioning weapons used by terrorists, but many countries say they will refuse to send troops to confront Hamas over its weapons. So we have this spectacular contradiction where the entire premise of the International Stabilization Force requires someone to actually disarm Hamas, but nobody wants to do it because they understand that would mean active combat operations against a resistance movement in an occupied territory, which would expose the entire charade of calling this peacekeeping. And let's talk about Pakistan specifically because this is where the imperial dynamics become so nakedly transparent that it's almost breathtaking in its cynicism, because Pakistan's most powerful military chief in decades, Field Marshal Asim Munir, is expected to fly to Washington to meet President Donald Trump in the coming weeks for a third meeting in 6 months that will likely focus on the Gaza force, and Munir has built a close relationship with Trump, and in June he was rewarded with a White House lunch, the first time a U.S. president hosted Pakistan's army chief alone without civilian officials and not contributing to the Gaza stabilization force could annoy Trump, which is no small matter for a Pakistani state that appears quite keen to remain in his good graces in great part to secure U.S. investment and security aid. So what we're looking at here is a quid pro quo, where Pakistan's military dictatorship, which just gave itself constitutional immunity from prosecution and extended its leader's term until 2030, gets American money and diplomatic cover in exchange for sending its soldiers to Gaza to do America's bidding, and the beautiful sick irony is that these would be Muslim-majority troops policing Palestinians, which gives the entire operation a veneer of regional legitimacy that American or Israeli forces could never provide. But here's what should absolutely enrage you about this entire framework, because when Rubio talks about establishing, quote, the Palestinian technocratic group that will help provide daily governance, unquote, what he's describing is the installation of a puppet administration that will have no democratic legitimacy, no popular mandate, and no actual sovereignty, because the new governance structure for Gaza will be made up of an international board and a group of Palestinian technocrats, and Rubio said the status quo is not sustainable in Gaza, where Israel has continued to strike Hamas targets while the militant group has reasserted its control since the October peace agreement, and that's why there's a sense of urgency about bringing Phase 1 to full completion, which is the establishment of the Board of Peace and the establishment of the Palestinian Technocratic Authority. And I need you to understand what technocratic means in this context, because technocratic is imperial speak for unelected, for pliable, for people who will administer services without questioning the fundamental power structures, and Article 9 of Trump's peace plan stipulates that Gaza will be governed under temporary transitional governance of a technocratic apolitical Palestinian committee, with oversight and supervision, provided by a board of peace, and Article 13 states that Hamas and other factions agree to not have any role in the governance of Gaza directly, indirectly, or in any form, which means the entire political architecture is designed to exclude any Palestinian faction that actually has popular support or fighting credibility. Now let me tell you what's actually being constructed here beneath all the diplomatic language, because what we're witnessing is the imposition of what scholars of empire call a trusteeship, which is a polite term for when imperial powers decide that a population is incapable of governing itself and needs foreign supervision, and the UN Security Council endorsed the US-backed comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict, and authorized the board member states working with it to establish a temporary international stabilization force in Gaza by a vote of 13 in favor to none against, with 2 abstentions from China and Russia. Notably, the force will not be an official UN peacekeeping force, sometimes referred to as Blue Helmets, because it will be overseen by the Board of Peace, which was also created by the resolution, and the UN Security Council has not sent any peacekeepers to Palestine or Israel, but has had thousands of peacekeepers stationed near Israel's borders since the 1970s, including UNIFIL in Lebanon and UNDOF in the occupied Golan Heights. So what makes this different is that this isn't even pretending to be neutral, UN peacekeeping. This is explicitly an American-led operation with Trump literally chairing the Board of Peace, which is such a dystopian formulation, I can barely process it. And the reason they're not using UN Blue Helmets is because UN peacekeeping comes with at least nominal requirements for neutrality and consent of all parties, whereas this stabilization force is explicitly designed to impose a political settlement. And here's where the historical echoes become so loud they're deafening, because if you know anything about the history of colonialism, you know that this exact playbook has been run before over and over again, where imperial powers identify local collaborators, who they call technocrats or moderates, install them in positions of nominal authority, back them up with foreign military force, and then claim they're promoting stability and development, while actually extracting resources and maintaining strategic control. And when the term neocolonialism was first proposed, it was applied to European countries' continued economic and cultural relationships with their former colonies, and Mehdi Ben Barka, the Moroccan political organizer, used the term to describe political trends in Africa in the early 1960s, and he headed the Commission on Neocolonialism, saying that the U.S. as the leading capitalist country of the world was in practice the principal neocolonialist political actor, and what Ben Barka understood in the 1960s is exactly what we're seeing now, which is that formal independence means nothing if foreign powers still control your economy, dictate your governance structures, and station troops on your territory. Now I want to address the profound cynicism of recruiting specifically Muslim-majority nations for this force, because U.S. Ambassador Mike Waltz said the force will be a strong coalition of peacekeepers, many from Muslim-majority nations like Indonesia and Azerbaijan. Pakistan, Azerbaijan, and Indonesia, all Muslim-majority states, were among the top contenders to supply troops for the ISF. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates, which joined the Abraham Accords in 2020 and recognized Israel, has said it will not participate until there is clarity on the legal framework. And do you see the perverse logic here, where Muslim-majority countries that have normalized relations with Israel under American pressure, like the UAE, are now too politically savvy to touch this with a 10-foot pole because they understand it would expose them as collaborators, while countries like Pakistan, that are desperate for American aid and diplomatic cover, are being pressured to provide troops specifically because their Muslim identity can be weaponized to make the occupation more palatable, and this is such a classic move from the colonial playbook, where you get people who look like the colonized population to be the face of colonial administration, so that resistance can be framed as internal conflict rather than anti-colonial struggle. And let's talk about what demilitarization actually means in practice, because when you hear Rubio and other American officials will talk about demilitarizing Gaza, what they're describing is the permanent disarmament of Palestinian resistance, while Israel maintains overwhelming military superiority and continues to control Gaza's borders, airspace, and coastline. And the primary goal of the ISF is to create a secure, demilitarized, and terror-free Gaza that poses no threat to its neighbors, and it would accomplish this by supporting the dismantling of Hamas's military infrastructure, including tunnels and weapons production facility. But notice what's completely absent from this framework, which is any discussion of Israeli occupation, any discussion of Israeli settlements, any discussion of the fundamental asymmetry of power that created the conditions for resistance in the first place. Israel objects to Turkey's participation in the ISF, viewing it as an adversary, with strong sympathy for Hamas, and Israel has also said it will not withdraw troops from inside Gaza until the territory is demilitarized. So Israel gets veto power over which countries can participate in the international force and gets to set the conditions for its own withdrawal, which means the entire operation is structured around Israeli security concerns with Palestinian self-determination, treated as at best a secondary consideration. Now here's where this becomes a perfect storm of imperial arrogance and willful blindness, because Hamas, which continues to control roughly half of the Gaza Strip, has rejected any imposed international guardianship plan, and reportedly many countries want to ensure their troops would be peacekeeping with the consent of all parties, as opposed to having to fight Hamas forces. Hamas rejected what it called an international trusteeship that's being imposed on the Gaza Strip and said an international force should be neutral and not turned into a party to the conflict. So the entire premise of this stabilization force is that it will operate without the consent of a feeling significant portion of the Palestinian population and without the consent of the organization that actually controls territory in Gaza, which means by definition, this is not peacekeeping, this is peace enforcement, which is military speak for imposing a political settlement through force, and the fact that countries are reluctant to commit troops precisely because they understand this could mean active combat against Hamas reveals that everyone involved knows this is a fig leaf for occupation, and I want you to understand the stakes of what's being normalized here, because we're watching in real time the construction of a new model of imperial control for the 21st century, where formal sovereignty is granted, but actual power remains in the hands of international institutions, dominated by Western powers, where elections are promised, but only parties acceptable to the occupier are allowed to govern, where economic reconstruction is offered, but only in exchange for political compliance, and where military occupation is rebranded as stabilization and security assistance. The big concern in Pakistan is that involvement of Pakistani troops in Gaza under a US-backed plan could reignite protests from Pakistan's Islamist parties that are deeply opposed to the US and Israel, and the Islamists have street power to mobilize thousands. And this is what happens when you try to outsource occupation to countries that still have democratic accountability to their populations, because Pakistani citizens understand that sending troops to Gaza under American command to disarm Palestinian resistance is collaboration with imperialism, and no amount of technocratic language about funding mechanisms can obscure that fundamental reality. Now let's talk about the profound hypocrisy and how this entire plan positions Israel, because the force will deploy under unified command to secure Gaza's streets, oversee demilitarization, protect civilians, and escort aid through safe corridors, all while Israel phases out its presence, and a vetted Palestinian police force takes on a new role. But Israel has killed over 69,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza health authorities. Israel has systematically destroyed hospitals, schools, and civilian infrastructure. Israel has created conditions that international observers have called genocidal, and now we're supposed to believe that the solution is an international force that will protect civilians while coordinating with the same Israeli military that has been killing those civilians. The resolution says the force should closely consult and cooperate with neighboring Egypt and Israel, and as the international force establishes control, Israeli forces will withdraw from Gaza based on standards, milestones, and timeframes linked to demilitarization. So Israeli withdrawal is conditional on Palestinian disarmament, but Palestinian security is not conditional on anything Israeli does, which once again reveals whose interests are actually being centered in this entire framework. And here's what makes this even more grotesque, because a European official said that the earliest training would begin for Palestinian police would be April, and then it would take a lot more time for them to actually be trained up, and that European official told NPR that the EU has been trying to convince the US that Gaza should just use the existing Palestinian law from the West Bank, so we're talking about training a new police force from scratch to enforce laws that may or may not exist, to provide security for a population that has just endured 2 years of bombardment and genocide, while foreign troops patrol their streets and unelected technocrat administer their daily lives, and we're supposed to believe this is a pathway to peace and self-determination, rather than a recipe for permanent dependency and structural violence. And I want to be clear that structural violence is not a metaphor. Structural violence is what happens when political and economic systems are designed in ways that prevent people from meeting their basic needs, that deny them political agency, that make them vulnerable to exploitation, and that's exactly what's being constructed in Gaza right now. Now let me tell you what this means for the broader architecture of global power, because what we're watching is not just about Gaza. What we're watching is the refinement of techniques of control that can be exported to other sites of imperial intervention. And when you have the United States delivering formal requests to over 70 nations to volunteer troops, what you're seeing is the construction of a global system where military intervention can be outsourced and internationalized in ways that diffuse political responsibility and make resistance harder to organize, because instead of fighting one occupier, you're fighting a coalition of nations operating under international authorization with the imprimatur of the UN Security Council and the language of humanitarian intervention, and this is how empire functions in the post-colonial era, not through direct annexation, but through complex multilateral arrangements that maintain the substance of colonial control while avoiding the form. And I need you to understand why Pakistan specifically is so important to this entire operation, beyond just the cynical deployment of Muslim troops to police Muslims, because Pakistan's diplomacy has helped stave off high U.S. tariffs that its neighbor India has borne, thrusting Pakistan back onto the world stage for the first time since the War on Terror, and contributing troops to the ISF could be a major win for Pakistan in its relationship with Trump, but would expose Pakistani leaders to severe criticism at home, and officials in Islamabad argue that Pakistan's potential participation stemmed from both moral responsibility and diplomatic necessity, and they noted that Pakistan was part of the original 8-country peace proposal conceived in late 2024, backed by several Muslim-majority states, that formed the basis of the U.S.-brokered Gaza peace plan. So Pakistan helped create this framework, which gives them a stake in seeing it implemented, but that also means they helped create a neo-colonial architecture for Gaza, and now they're being asked to enforce it militarily. And the fact that this is framed as moral responsibility rather than imperial collaboration shows how deeply the language of humanitarian intervention has corrupted our ability to recognize domination when we see it. Now here's where we need to talk about the technocratic government being proposed, because when Rubio mentions establishing the Palestinian Technocratic Group, we need to understand what that actually means in practice, and representatives of Hamas and Palestinian Authority officials affiliated with the rival Fatah faction are reportedly getting close to an agreement on a document outlining post-war governance in Gaza, and unnamed officials from both factions said the agreement would establish a committee of 10 to 15 non-partisan technocrats with expertise in economy, education, health, humanitarian aid and reconstruction that would answer to the head of the PA in the West Bank. But the officials stated that the committee would prevent Hamas from governing Gaza, but news reports did not mention whether the agreement would allow Hamas to remain active, and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has repeatedly asserted that Israel would not accept Hamas remaining in Gaza. So we have this impossible framework where Hamas is supposed to relinquish political control, but may continue to exist as an organization, which means the technocratic government will be administering a territory where armed resistance groups that don't recognize their authority are still present, which is a recipe for either permanent conflict or for the International Stabilization Force to become an occupation army fighting an insurgency. And let's be absolutely clear about what apolitical and technocratic mean in this context, because Article 9 stipulates Gaza will be governed under temporary transitional governance of a technocratic apolitical Palestinian committee, but governance is inherently political. Every decision about resource allocation, about law enforcement, about economic policy, about who gets to rebuild what and where, is a political decision, and calling something technocratic doesn't make it neutral. What it does is disguise political choices as technical expertise, and that disguise serves a very specific function, which is to insulate decision-makers from democratic accountability, because if something is just a technical matter, then you don't need to consult the population, you don't need elections, you don't need political debate, you just need experts, and guess who gets to decide who counts as an expert? The occupying power and its international backers. Unless Washington clarifies its preferences and red lines on this issue, it runs the risk of legitimizing a future role for Hamas, there resulting in a fait accompli that is incompatible with American priority, which makes crystal clear that the entire process of selecting this technocratic committee is about ensuring Palestinian governance aligns with American priorities, not Palestinian needs. Now I want you to think about the historical trajectory we're on here, because the Egyptian foreign minister stated that 15 Palestinian technocrats had been chosen to lead a post-war interim administration for the Gaza Strip, and he added that the list had been agreed by all Palestinian factions, including Hamas, and had been vetted by Israel, so we have a list of Palestinian leaders who have been approved by Israel, the occupying power, and by all the factions including Hamas, and this is supposed to be a technocratic apolitical committee, but it required political negotiations between rival Palestinian factions and approval from the state that has been bombing Gaza for 2 years. And the fact that Israel gets veto power over Palestinian leadership, while Palestinians get no say over Israeli policies, perfectly encapsulates the asymmetry of power that no amount of international stabilization forces can actually address, unless their mandate includes constraining in Israeli actions, which it explicitly does not. And here's where the comparison to historical colonial arrangements becomes unavoidable, because what's being proposed for Gaza is structurally identical to the mandate system that was established after World War I, when the League of Nations gave European powers control over former Ottoman territories under the guise of preparing them for self-government, and those mandates were supposed to be temporary. They were supposed to be about capacity building and development, but what they actually were was a new form of colonial control with international legitimation, and we know how that worked out for Palestine, because the British mandate created the conditions for the Nakba, for the ethnic cleansing of 1948, for the permanent displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and now we're doing it again with slightly different institutional arrangements, but the same fundamental logic, which is that Palestinians cannot be trusted to govern themselves and need foreign supervision. But wait, there's more, because the longer all this lingers, the longer there's no reconstruction for Palestinians in Gaza, the longer they live in tents in the rain and cold, and just in the last 2 months of the ceasefire, officials say hundreds of Palestinians have been killed by Israeli fire, and several Israeli soldiers have been killed by Palestinian fire, so lives are at stake. The longer Gaza remains in this limbo, and this is the cruelest part of the entire scheme, which is that reconstruction aid is being held hostage to political compliance, which means Palestinians who have lost everything, who are living in destroyed cities without adequate food, water, or medical care, are being told that they can only get help if they accept a governance structure designed by their occupiers, enforced by foreign troops, and administered by unelected technocrats. And this is structural violence at its most refined, because the choice being offered is not really a choice at all. It's accept permanent dependency or continue to suffer. And when people resist that impossible choice, they will be labeled terrorists and extremists and opponents of peace. Now let's talk about the mandate for this international force, because the U.S. resolution calls for the stabilization force to ensure the process of demilitarizing the Gaza Strip and the permanent decommissioning of weapons from non-state armed groups, and a big question is how to disarm Hamas, which has not fully accepted that step, and it authorizes the force to use all necessary measures to carry out its mandate in compliance with international law, which is UN language for the use of military force. So we have explicit authorization for military force to disarm Palestinian resistance groups, whether they consent or not, and this is being called peacekeeping, but Hamas says it would welcome the ISF as a peacekeeping force in Gaza, and that it has long agreed to give up governance of the territory to a Palestinian technocratic committee, but Hamas says the ISF should only be used as a buffer to separate Israeli forces and Palestinians, and that any international forces should not be inside Palestinian population centers of Gaza. So even Hamas, which is supposedly the obstacle to peace, is saying they would accept an international force if it actually functioned as a peacekeeping buffer, but instead what's being proposed is an enforcement mechanism embedded in population centers with authority to use military force for disarmament. And here's where you need to understand the imperial logic of what's being normalized, because critics note that judging by the 2006 expansion of Lebanon's peacekeeping UNIFIL force that failed miserably in achieving any of its missions, one must look with skepticism at a similar force that might be deployed in Gaza, and unless Israel can find reliable Palestinian partners that can keep the peace, it is unlikely that alien troops can do the job, despite the generous funding that global powers are willing to make available, and UNIFIL is actually the perfect comparison, because UNIFIL is tasked with securing the Israel-Lebanon border, and helping establish an area free of any armed personnel assets and weapons south of the Litani River. But UNIFIL's 10,000 peacekeepers from 49 countries have looked the other way, as Hezbollah's arsenal has grown to an estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles, and since October 7th, UNIFIL has failed to prevent Hezbollah from attacking Israel from southern Lebanon, so we have a 20-year track record of UN peacekeeping in Lebanon that has completely failed to achieve its stated mission of disarmament, and yet we're supposed to believe that a similar force in Gaza will somehow work better. But here's the thing, and this is crucial, the failure of UNIFIL is actually not a failure from the perspective of certain actors, because what UNIFIL does is maintain a status quo that benefits multiple parties. Israel gets a buffer, Lebanon gets to claim it's trying to control Hezbollah without actually confronting them, the international community gets to feel like they're doing something, and life goes on, and there is an economic incentive to keep these forces in place, because a significant portion of the multi-billion-dollar cost is spent locally, and scores of people are hired to do jobs that the UN does not require an expatriate employee to do, and shutting mission down, therefore means ending a significant source of commerce and employment. And this is what happens with these permanent peacekeeping missions. They become self-perpetuating. They create local economies dependent on their presence. They generate bureaucracies invested in their continuation, and they allow conflicts to be managed rather than resolved, which from an imperial perspective is actually ideal, because resolved conflicts might produce outcomes that don't align with American or Israeli interests, whereas managed conflicts can be controlled indefinitely. Now I need you to understand what this means for Palestinian self-determination, because what's being proposed is not a pathway to statehood, it's a pathway to permanent trusteeship, and Pakistan's representative noted that several important suggestions made by his and other delegations did not appear in the text, including a clear political path to Palestinian statehood, an affirmation of the Palestinian Authority's central role in governance and reconstruction, and clarification regarding the force's mandate, and those are all crucial aspects with a bearing on the success of this endeavor. So even Pakistan, which is being recruited to provide troops for this mission, is pointing out that there's no actual path to statehood in the plan, which means the entire framework is about managing the occupation, not ending it. And Russia's UN ambassador said Moscow took note of support from Arab and Muslim nations, but abstained because the resolution did not include a role for the Security Council or emphatically support Palestinian statehood. And when Russia is pointing out the lack of commitment to Palestinian statehood, you know something is deeply wrong, because Russia is hardly a champion of self-determination, but even they can see that this plan is designed to maintain indefinite Israeli control. And let's talk about the Board of Peace that Trump is supposed to chair, because this is where the imperial arrogance reaches almost parodic levels, where the U.S. resolution endorses Trump's 20-point ceasefire plan, which calls for a yet-to-be-established Board of Peace as a transitional authority that Trump would head, and it also authorizes the stabilization force and gives it a wide mandate, including overseeing the borders, providing security and demilitarizing the territory, and authorization for the board and force expire at the end of 2027. So Donald Trump, who has explicitly aligned himself with the Israeli right, who moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, who recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, who has called for the complete destruction of Hamas, this man is going to chair the Board of Peace, overseeing Gaza's reconstruction, and we're supposed to believe this is a neutral international framework, rather than American imperial control, with a thin multilateral veneer, and the fact that it expires at the end of 2027 is telling, because that's just long enough to get through Trump's term, which suggests this entire structure is about managing Gaza during a specific political window, not about creating sustainable long-term peace. Now here's what you need to understand about why countries are reluctant to commit troops, because the conference, which reportedly excluded Turkey at Israel's request, failed to decide on the mandate of the would-be peacekeeping force, and no nation wants to put its troops in harm's way, and several Arab and Muslim states are reluctant to contribute as they fear they may be seen as collaborate with Israel or the U.S., and there has also been a lack of clarity regarding the mandate of the force, and whether it will end up being responsible for disarming Hamas, and end up in active conflict with the Palestinian group and U.S. Central Command, held a conference in Doha, Qatar to clarify a mandate for the ISF. However, it reportedly ended inconclusively, with none of the estimated 45 countries in attendance making a concrete pledge to provide troops. So you have 45 countries at a conference specifically convened to get commitments for troops, and not a single one commits, which tells you everything you need to know about how politically toxic this mission is understood to be. And the reason it's toxic is because everyone understands that this is not peacekeeping, this is counterinsurgency, this is occupation by proxy, and any country that contributes troops will be seen as collaborating with Israeli and American domination of Palestine. And I want to talk about what Trump's peace plan actually envisions in its most revealing moments, because U.S. troops will need to deploy to Gaza if the international force that Trump's ceasefire plan envisions is to become a reality, according to what Egypt has told the U.S. and senior Egyptian officials told their U.S. counterparts that they want the ISF to be modeled on the multinational force, observers that deployed to Sinai after the peninsula was returned to Egypt from Israel in 1982, and the U.S. has led the MFO since its inception, supplying hundreds of troops as a buffer and reassurance force. So Egypt, which has its own reasons for wanting stability in Gaza, and its own complicated relationship with Hamas, and its own authoritarian government that benefits from American support, is saying they'll only participate if there are American troops involved, which would mean direct U.S. military presence in Gaza for the first time. The Egyptian request, which has been communicated publicly and privately, is likely to test Trump's appetite for a deeper military footprint in Gaza, and one former senior U.S. official familiar with the request said it was a non-starter, which reveals the fundamental dishonesty of this whole operation, because the U.S. wants to control outcomes in Gaza, but doesn't want to pay the political cost of putting American soldiers at risk. Now let me tell you what's being left out of this entire framework, because nowhere in any of these discussions about international forces and technocratic governments and demilitarization is there any serious conversation about Israeli accountability, Israeli settlements, the siege of Gaza, the right of return, the status of Jerusalem, or any of the fundamental issues that actually drive the conflict. And that's not an accident. That's by design, because the entire purpose of this stabilization framework is to freeze the status quo in place, to make the occupation sustainable, to prevent Palestinian resistance from threatening Israeli dominance, and to do all of that under the banner of peace and reconstruction and security. And Israel and the U.S. will not allow a neutral force anywhere near Gaza, which means a foreign deployment could only be one that aids Israeli ethnic cleansing plans. And this is the analysis from critical scholars looking at this, who understand that in the context of overwhelming Israeli power and American support, any international force will inevitably function to serve Israeli security interests regardless of its nominal mandate. And here's where we need to talk about the technocratic government's relationship to democracy, because the PA has little popular support or legitimacy among Palestinians, in part because it has not held elections in 18 years, and its policy of cooperating with Israel on security matters, extremely unpopular, and has led many Palestinians to view it as a subcontractor of the occupation. And the PA has also been unable to prevent Israeli occupation from expanding, including stopping Israel's illegal settlement expansion, home demolition orders, and wide-scale arrests, and it has struggled to address major concerns about the status of Jerusalem, the eastern half of which remains occupied by Israel, as well as Palestinian refugees, and the right of return. So the Palestinian Authority, which is supposed to play a role in this technocratic governance structure, is already seen by most Palestinians as a collaborator with occupation, and now we're going to import that same model to Gaza and expect it to work. Hamas has rejected the formation of the new government as illegitimate, calling instead for all Palestinian factions, including Fatah, to form a power-sharing government ahead of national elections. But of course elections are not part of this framework, because elections might produce results that Israel and the U.S. don't like. Now let's think about what resistance to this framework will look like, because Pakistani foreign minister said last month that Islamabad could consider contributing troops for peacekeeping, but disarming Hamas is not our job, so even Pakistan, which is being heavily pressured to participate, is already drawing red lines saying they'll do peacekeeping, but not disarmament, which means if disarmament is actually required, someone else will have to do it, which brings us back to the fundamental impossibility of this mission, because nobody wants to be the force that actively fights Hamas in Gaza, which means either the disarmament mandate will be quietly abandoned, or the mission will fail, or it will turn into a grinding counterinsurgency that costs lives, achieves nothing, and eventually collapses amid political recriminations. And this is what happened in Lebanon, this is what happened in Afghanistan, this is what happened in Iraq, this is what happens when you try to impose political outcomes through military force in places where you have no legitimacy and no popular support. And here's what makes me angriest about this entire disgraceful episode, beyond the cynicism, beyond the imperialism, beyond the manipulation of international institutions in service of occupation. What makes me angriest is the utter contempt for Palestinian agency that runs through every aspect of this plan, because at no point in any of these discussions about funding mechanisms and rules of engagement in technocratic committees is there any genuine engagement with what Palestinians actually want, what they've been saying for decades, which is freedom, self-determination, the right of return, the end of occupation, and instead we get this paternalistic framework where foreign powers and unelected experts will decide how Gaza should be governed, how it should be secured, how it should be reconstructed, and Palestinians will be expected to be grateful for this imposed order, and when they resist, as they inevitably will, because human beings resist domination, they will be labeled extremists and terrorists and obstacles to peace, and the entire cycle will begin again. This is colonialism. This is what it looks like in the 21st century, with UN resolutions and international conferences and peacekeeping mandates and technocratic language, but the substance is the same, which is powerful states dictating terms to weaker populations, using force when necessary, dressing it up in humanitarian language, and maintaining structures of domination that serve their strategic interests. And the Commission on Neocolonialism said that the U.S. as the leading capitalist country of the world was in practice the principal neocolonialist political actor, and critics of neocolonialism argue that investment by multinational corporations enriches few and underdeveloped countries, causes humanitarian, environmental, and ecological damage to their populations. And that's exactly what we're about to see in Gaza, where reconstruction will benefit international contractors, where security contracts will enrich military companies, where political structures will serve American interests, and where ordinary Palestinians will continue to live under occupation, just with different uniforms patrolling their streets, and different bureaucrats denying their rights. And this is the future that's being sold to us as peace, as progress, as stability, and we have to reject it, we have to name it for what it is, and we have to stand in solidarity with Palestinian resistance to this entire framework, because the alternative is to be complicit in the construction of a new model of imperial control that will be exported to other sites of domination around the world.